speaker from side proposition to open this debate. Oh yeah. Speaking time will be 8 minutes, and the first and last minute are protected. I will give a sign with this whistle after the first minute. Before the last minute, the whistle was not my idea. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that every object may have destructive force, but a free society never bans people from driving a car or holding a knife. So today, as a proposition, we support the right to bear arms in every nation. But coming to definition, by bearing arms, we mean that you can buy unmechanized weapons from government-certified shops. And by doing that, you must satisfy 3 criteria. Firstly, you must be above 18. That means that you can take full responsibility of the acts caused by acts caused by you. And secondly, you have to have medical proofs to prove that you are mentally stable and healthy. Thirdly, you have to pass certain shooting tests, which means that we have to make sure that you know how to use the gun properly and correctly. And all the other restrictions of use just follows the restriction of use of knives, which means that such as you cannot simply bring knives to an airplane. Today, as proposition, we'll present you with one principal argument of why the right to bear an arm is inalienable as a human right, and in practical level, why by allowing people to bear arms can result on better lower crime rates in society as a whole. So, moving on to the principal argument on bodily autonomy, the right to bear arms is inalienable to you as human beings and should not be contagious to other outcomes that might cause. First layer of analysis, we believe that currently all the protection provided by the government is on the very basic level by providing you a common safety net, which means that the government only sends some policemen to your district, or only keep these criminals away from you by imprisonment. However, we believe that there are 2 features of the government protection makes them ineffective to everyone in society. Firstly, it is indirect, which means that the police cannot be with you 24/7 or cannot arrive in any second when you feel unsafe. And secondly, it is very retroactive, which means that in the case of imprisonment, we can only keep the criminals away only when the harm has already impacted to the society. Yes.
We would tell you that in every 1,000 cases of defense actually working with guns, there's 52,000 instances of actual intentional deaths caused by guns.
So the opposition side cannot simply argue that because we guarantee everyone the right to use guns, that everyone will actively use guns to hurt others. We'll present you to the mentality of criminals in my practical arguments. And moving on to the second layer, why the right to so when all the external forces are not that as effective as you want, we believe that the right to protect yourself is inalienable. We believe that the right to protect yourself is a crucial part of your bodily autonomy, which means that you can protect yourself whenever you feel yourself in danger. You can protect yourself. You can decide how you're going to protect yourself as long as it does not cause third-party harm. We say that it's the similar case just apply in civil school, where the state entrusts you to the use of knives as long as you do not actively hurt others. And we see that when you use an object to hurt others, you'll be in prison and be deprived of the right to use that. So we see that there are already cases existing in the civil school where people are using certain objectives as long as it does not cause third party harm. So we say that when the government bans you from bearing arms, you are surrendering all your bodily autonomy to an external forces that is so unstable and so ineffective that cannot show up when every moment you need. We say that this puts the individual in a very dangerous position where themselves cannot feel safe. Just as what I have analyzed to you, how the police and all the military forces cannot impact at any moment. And furthermore, we say that every objective can have a destructive force, such as you can simply drive a truck and to kill hundreds of people. But in this other free society, never bans people from doing that, because we say that we believe in our law enforcement and can actually effect the criminals' cost-benefit analysis when they actually use the objects to do destructive things to society. They will be punished in our law, and we say that by guaranteeing citizens' rights to bear arms, it can lead to better defense, which moves to the practical argument of how supporting the right to bear arms can lead to, firstly, better government regulation, and secondly, better defense and lower crime rates in the society.
On that?
Later. So we say that firstly, on the idea of better regulation, we have to concede that on the both sides, the black market always exists. The criminals, all the intended criminals can get destructive weapons, no matter what. However, in our side, the government can actually have a control of all the arms buyers. It's just as said in our model that people have to buy the arms from government certified shops. We say that the government can have control of who is currently holding these arms, how many people are having arms, and so on and so forth. We see that because the government have an overall idea on the gun use in the society, the government can initiate better decision making toward the potential outcomes. And which leads to the second practical argument of how it leads to better defense and lower crime rates. We say that crimes happens when the power asymmetry exists between the criminals and the targeted victims in the status quo. Because we have already proven to you in the status quo, the criminals can always get the more destructive weapons in the black market. However, when we guarantee the citizens the use of guns, when we tell them it is okay for you to use guns to defend yourself in face of danger, it will change the criminal's mentality. Because what they were thinking is that I have guns while others do not have, or others do not have the gun as powerful as me. So that the only cost I will bear is to be in prison or be sentenced by the court. But they will always neglect the possibility that they themselves might be shot by the victims. So we say that when we add one more layer of to the cost benefits analysis to the criminals, when we say that all their targeted victims can also be the one that can shoot him to death, we say that the criminals would be more deterred into actually committing these criminal acts, as they know that these victims are not as easy as to deal with as in the past. And we say that by changing the mentality of these criminals, can we actually lower the crime rate and promote more stability in the society. And my second speaker will further prove to you why it's not only a fundamental human right for you to protect yourself, but also a fundamental political right for people in face of the power asymmetry between the government of people. Very proud to propose.
Alright, speaking time was 8 minutes and 11 seconds.
Before we continue, I'd just like to remind everybody, please, to keep order in the room while the speakers are speaking. Don't speak too loudly if you're talking with your teammates. Thank you.
Okay. So now I'd like to call on the first speaker for team opposition.
At a point where there are more shootings around the world than there are days on the calendar every single year, we think it's clear that gun ownership and gun violence is a big problem. That's why we are so proud to oppose today's motion. What will I give you in my speech today? First, I'll give you some framing and definitions for how to look at today's round. Secondly, I will refute my opponent's arguments. And third, I will deliver two substantive arguments for why you stand on the opposition. My partner Shreyoshi will deliver the third. With that in mind, let's begin. First, we define a right as something to which one has a just claim to. So for example, every person has a right to petition their government. But we think this is different from a privilege. A privilege is when certain people are restricted from accessing something. So for example, under their model, when there's all of these regulations on gun ownership, we don't think they're defending a right, they're defending a privilege. What are the burdens of today's round? Team proposition must prove why bearing arms is a right, and why it is both principally and practically just for us to have this right to bear arms. The opposition must prove either it is principally or practically not beneficial and even harmful to have this right to bear arms. Here's our stance in this round. We think that owning guns is a privilege that should be determined based off of 1. A degree of merits. 2nd, logical and legitimate reasoning. And 3rd, stringent regulations. For example, like we see in Japan, where there is very low gun ownership because only very few people are allowed to access them in the first place. With that in mind, let's move on to our opponent's case. For their stance, we want to ask them to distinguish between whether they support a right to own guns or a privilege to bear arms. We think these are very different things, and they have to clarify this in today's round. But first, their principle is on the inalienable right to own firearms. We think that your model contradicts your principle. You want a lot of regulations on gun ownership, and then you say that every single person has this right to self-defense. You say that every single person should have the right to own these guns. We think this is inherently contradictory, because that means that even people under the age of 18, for example, 17-year-olds, should also have the right to defend themselves. Your own model contradicts your principle. Secondly, we think there are other ways to achieve security. Look towards countries like Germany, Australia, and Japan, all of which people are allowed to defend themselves, just not using guns. Next, they say that the government support in the status quo is insufficient, but they don't prove to you why there should be a limit on the weapons that you can own. So if you think that every single person should have the right to defend themselves, why can't we own tanks or nuclear bombs? These are all ways to defend yourself, but we think there is a reason there are limitations, because they provide far bigger societal harms than the benefits for the individual. And finally, they ask why we don't just ban knives and cars. Because knives and cars aren't designed to specifically kill things. The goal of a gun is to kill an individual or an animal. The goal of a car is to drive. The goal of a knife is to chop things up, not to kill people. So in these instances, we don't think first that they have the same intention, but even beyond that, they're nowhere near as damaging as guns are. Guns are immediate, they are fast to fire, and they can kill massive amounts of people in a very short period of time. But secondly, they talk about the practical and a decrease in crime. We think that first, on the black market, the idea that just because a black market exists, it's not a reason to stand on the proposition. People don't have a right to get heroin simply because there is a black market for heroin. This is not a reason to stand with the proposition. And secondly, they think that criminals are deferred. But like Layla tells you in her point of information, for every 1,000 defensive uses of firearms, there are 52,000 instances where they are used in a violent way to take away someone else's rights. We think this is far more important, and that you weigh the 52,000 over the 1,000. But next, let's move on to our first substantive argument on the principle, which is societal welfare. The first layer of analysis here is on individual welfare. We think that the right to bear arms creates this idea that there should be universal access to firearms. Why is this so bad? Because the goal of a gun, like I told you earlier, is to kill someone. So you're basically equipping every individual with the right to take away somebody else's life. We think this is principally unjust, because in a world where every single person has the right to own a weapon designed to kill someone else, basically, every single person has this right to take away another person's life. Beyond that, we think that by equipping people with this, it's principally bad, because it empowers you to also take away the rights of somebody else. So even if you aren't killing another individual, you're still taking away a right to property if you use a gun in a theft. You're also taking away someone else's rights in these instances. By using these guns, we are equipping people with the right to take away another person's right. We don't think this is just, but you would disagree.
That's exactly why we deprive people of the right to arm if they use the arm to cause a third-party harm. And that's why we deprive this right when they're in a prison.
Okay, the idea that these are the only instances where people shouldn't own arms is pretty problematic, because that means that everyone else in society should be able to own arms. Everyone else should have the right to kill someone else. Like we tell you, the goal of a gun is to kill. So if you have a right to a gun, you have the right to kill. But the second layer of analysis here is on societal security. We think that the government does have an obligation to protect its own citizens, but the right to bear arms is uniquely dangerous for two reasons. First, because of the practical problems. When every single person in society has a gun, not only do you create fear and paranoia, but you also allow every single person to go out there and create a mass shooting or a terror attack. But secondly, it's principally dangerous because it equips individuals with an ability to disrupt social stability. There is a reason that no country in the world allows their citizens to own a nuclear weapon, because it threatens to destroy the societal security that all of us value. Society in the first place was created to defend every single person's right, but in a world where everyone is entitled to gun ownership, everyone is entitled to rob others of their rights. Our second substantive argument is on the practical, which is reducing violent crimes. The first layer of analysis here is on self-inflicted deaths. The first layer here is on accidental deaths. The right to bear arms means an increase in gun ownership compared to a world where this is not a right. Why is this so? First of all, we don't have this gun culture. And second of all, we don't have this competitive fear. Every single person has a gun, so I have to own a gun too. We don't think this is the right mindset. This means that under opposition's world, we reduce the amount of accidental shootings, which in 2014, in just the United States, numbered 1,606, and in 2015 was 1,963. All of those are people who were killed in accidental shootings, not intentional ones, and we think that's very harmful. But secondly here is intentional shootings. When people who are mentally ill end up acquiring these weapons, they have a much higher likelihood of successfully taking their own life. That's why in countries where there is a right to bear arms, people have much higher rates of gun suicide, because it's a lot easier to successfully take your own life with a gun than with other methods. We think that's very problematic, and for society, we should oppose. Our second layer of analysis here is on increasing societal terror. Historically, gun ownership rates are associated with the rates of violent crime in both individual US states and around the world globally. Why is this true? The right to bear arms makes it easier for you to acquire a gun, because you have a right to that gun. You are entitled to it. And that means that we have many problems around the world. We have more homicides because more people are allowed to have guns. They use it in the spur of the moment or intentionally. We have more terrorism because terrorists can more easily acquire these guns when they are sold everywhere. And third of all, we have more mass shootings around the world. In fact, in just the United States, 2 out of the 5 worst mass shootings in their history was committed in the past 3 months. But never forget that every mass shooting is the worst shooting for someone. It's for this reason, to protect human life, that we are so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 14 seconds. Okay, so now I'd like to call upon the second speaker for team proposition.
Just like setting a grocery store.
Is this house ready? Okay, at this point, I think it's safe for us to say that it's not right for you to surrender oil autonomy to an external force, which is alien and which is retroactive and which you cannot personally control. So before that, before my construct speech, in which I will talk about how there is no causational link between gun rights and to the massive destruction that the opposition has observed. And second, I will discuss why citizens should have the political right to bear arms. So before that, I have 6 rebuttals. First, on the idea that statistics alone can prove the denial of gun rights. So, right, their statistics are firstly self-defeating because they mentioned that in 1,000 successful instances where people succeeded to deter violent crimes, there are another 52 instances where people intentionally use gun to kill. So we think these statistics actually benefit our side because it shows that gun actually help people to deter crimes. And but moreover, we think yes, the gun right is not contingent on the consequentialism that our opposition is trying to promote, but it is an unalienable right. And even if we think. Even if there, we are discussing the gun actual situation where a gunman is trying to kill you, my first speaker has proven to you that the criminals, when they decide to kill, they are concerned with his own safety. Like say, many men when they are robbing the banks, they want to survive. So when they're trying to use a gun to pointing at the reception, we think under our policy, the reception man can own the gun, and that man can just use the gun to deter that criminal because the criminal wants to survive and wants to live a luxurious life. That's why he's robbing the bank. So actually, if we have the excellent marksmen in our society, we think those crimes will not happen. Right? Now, moving on to the second rebuttal is on the idea that intentional shooting will be tolerated in our world. But it's not true, right? As clearly in many massive school shootings as happening in the USA. Firstly, many terrorists use the mechanized weapons such as TJ-19. So yes, our government is trying to regulate the gun market, so we'll make the mechanized weapons less available. And secondly, we argue that if the school guards are allowed to bear arms, and if there is a general trend for schools to allow the school guards to own guns, we think those terrorists, when they try to break into the school, the guards can simply use their own guns to shoot that terrorists. And we think the terrorists are simply outnumbered by the school guards. So moving on to the third rebuttal, they argue, yes, I think it's very understandable for the childish kids on the opposition to think that it's unfair for a 16-year-old not to have the right to own a gun. But yeah, we have to acknowledge that for people who are underage, that you are deprived of many rights because you are simply not considered as a mature human being. But we think it's proper in this instance for your guardians to exercise the right of God. So, sorry. Third rebuttal, they try to rely on the idea of how a thing has a certain intention, like the gun's purpose is to kill, and the purpose for cars to drive. But in that instance, they confuses the purpose of the object and the actual usage. Right? We argue that everything has a destructive potential. And the opposition cannot simply say that if a car has a potential to crush crowds, then we ban all cars. That is a logical fallacy. So moving on to their own case, right? I want to deconstruct their case. The opposition tried to get us to accept the belief that we cannot own guns on 2 grounds. Firstly, they argue that gun right is a privilege. They must be based on a degree of merits. But which side actually supports privilege? Clearly, it's the opposition, because because they are trying to restrict the gun rights to certain minority groups, such as a so-called fox hunting association, for example. That is not right, because every citizen is equal. We support the natural right theory of gun rights, right? We argue that every citizen must be allowed to own guns. The opposition must prove to us why gun rights must be exclusive to those hunters and to those noble men in Britain. So moving on to the third rebuttal, they argue that gun rights is finally going to damage our social security. However, we argue that the fear and the exact chaos that the gun shootings are causing is exactly due to the kind of over-dependence on state means to protect you. That means average citizens don't have the realization that they can use their own capabilities to defend themselves. Yes, even if in America we have the actual gun right, we have different voices. So we think today the government is adamant to promote the notion of gun right, of self-defense. And that's why we think the chaos and fear that we have witnessed in Las Vegas, for example, will not happen. So moving on to the final rebuttal on the idea that why not let everyone have nuclear weapons. So firstly, we argue that the gun is just the proper limit for a destructive object that a citizen can have, right? Yes, it's very clear that you cannot have tanks and nuclear weapons, right? So moving on to my own constructive speech. And in my speech, I'm going to prove you two things. Firstly, there's no direct constitutional link between gun right and gun shoot. And secondly, why every citizen must have a political right to own guns. Any POIs?
Yes. At what point is it justified for you to limit a right to the point that it becomes a privilege?
Right. So the opposition is the side that trying to ban all those poisons and ban all those knives simply because they have a destructive potential. However, we argue that if a gun is used by a virtuous man, is used by a reasonable man, is used by a mentally healthy man, as guaranteed by our policy, we think all those bad consequences will not happen. So moving on to my constructive speech. No more points. So firstly, gun rights will not lead to gun shoots necessarily, because firstly, the current gun shoots are more attributable to gun trafficking and gun contrabands. As we have seen that in Europe, terrorists are, if they are going to possess a gun, that means that he's definitely is going to trade with underground traders. And those weapons they have obtained are mostly mechanized weapons. So we think if the government regulates the market, the gun types will be restricted to many kind of light and unmechanized weapons such as bird guns and yes, our guns we have seen used by American cowboys. The second thing, right? We argue that the state is currently the only legitimate monopolizer of violence, and why the existing checks and balances is not enough to compensate for the power asymmetry. The existing measures, like you can vote for representation that distance you from the state, you cannot actually influence the politics in many countries. For example, in China, in South Korea. That's why we argue that if every Chinese citizen is allowed to own guns, you can actually exercise an actual influence on the state policies. The Xi Jinping will feel himself with physical threat by actual threat of being shot on the street. And secondly, we argue that the state is using violence to kill anyone in seconds, but people may have the rhetorical power to influence. And why is this check and balances important? The only way to change the regime is through arms, is through posing a physical threat to the leader. And the opposition can never prove that state will be eternally good intention, and be good intended, and the citizens must always retain the right to fight against the state. Right, that's all I want to say. Thank you very much.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 57 seconds. All right. I'd now like to call upon the second speaker for team opposition.
In the close to 9-minute speech we heard in the last speech, we still see that there are a litany of abuses and issues that side proposition has yet to clarify for us. In this speech, I'm going to be pointing out just that. I'll first be explaining 2 contradictions that side proposition makes in their case. Then I'll be explaining 2 key assumptions side proposition makes in this debate before offering the third substantive argument on side opposition. So the first contradiction that they make is that they say in their first substantive argument that everyone deserves this right to own a gun, but then their model institutes such a long list of regulations that only a small elite group of people would ever be able to own a gun in the first place. I ask them, if it's so important to have this right to having a gun for self-defense purposes or whatever else reason, then why is it that only a small subsection of the population gets to own it in the first place? It seems that this right is limited. And dare I say it seems that this right is a privilege instead. That's what side opposition is advocating for. We think that it is justified for us to restrict guns because it is a privilege, because we demand that people prove that they are able to own a gun in the first place to ensure that safety of the entire society as well as individuals can be protected. The second key contradiction that side proposition makes in their case is that they say that the government has regulation control over guns, and they have, quote, better decision-making power in regards to the black market and gun control. But earlier, in their first argument, they say that the government isn't able to protect the citizens adequately. That's why we need guns in the first place. I ask them what their stance is. Is the government a beneficial actor, or is the government incapable of actually protecting its citizens? Because at the point at which it's the latter, and the government isn't able to protect its citizens, yet they still advocate that the government has control over certain programs, it seems that their stance is shifting in today's round. Side opposition gives you a clear stance that the government does have the ability to protect its citizens, and I'm going to be explaining that in the first key assumption that side proposition makes. That assumption is that they assume that getting rid of one form of protection gets rid of all other forms of protection. We think that this is a ludicrous claim. People still have access to things like self-defense classes and other less deadly weapons if they would like to defend themselves on an individual level. But, and more importantly, we think that the state's protection is better. Governmental protection is better for 2 key reasons, one on the principle level, one on the practical level. First, on principle, we think that governments actually have an affirmative principal obligation to protect their citizens and do everything in their power to protect the majority of their society. This is what gives governments the specific justification to use military force when necessary to protect society. That's why individuals don't have the right to own things like guns, because they don't have an obligation to protect the entirety of society to use force on a massive level. That is reserved for governments. But the practical reason as to why government protection is better is because governments simply have more resources to protect their individuals better. They have things like funding into defense programs. They have things like training programs that they can actually institute and standardize so that police officers across the country can actually help protect their citizens much better. We see that governments have things like military budgets that allow them to innovate and to find new ways to protect their citizens. That's why protection we receive from the government is inherently better than that we would receive on an individual level if we just expected everybody to take the obligation on themselves to start protecting everybody else. The second key assumption that side proposition makes is that they assume that guns overall are not used to hurt people. We think that this is also quite contradictory, because they at the same time say that guns are used for self-defense if an attacker comes to attack you. And it seems that guns are still being used to hurt people in either world. Our argument on side opposition is that giving somebody the right to take somebody else's life is principally unjust. Why? It's because this runs contrary to what we as humans, as a society, have agreed upon. As a society, we have agreed upon protecting other people, not killing other people to achieve that protection. But furthermore, we think that Layla's POI about how for every 1,000 self-defense uses of guns, there have been 52,000 cases of intentional homicides. We think that the danger of using these guns outweighs any possible self-defense uses. And we think that guns actually aren't the best for self-defense. Why? It's because guns can actually be used against victims if an adversarial circumstance was actually able to occur. Take the example of a woman who is perhaps being sexually harassed by a rapist. We see that oftentimes the attacker can overpower their victims because of the circumstances of the attack, and that's how, if you're holding a gun, it can be turned against you. That's what makes these crimes so deadly, because oftentimes the people who try to defend themselves aren't able to because they don't know how to use these guns. They don't have training. However, in a world of regulations, that's what we offer you. We offer a safer world in which people still get the ability to defend themselves, but it is more controlled and safer. I'll take your point.
Would you willing to concede that in the 52,000 cases, there is a power asymmetry between the attacker and the person being attacked? If gun rights are generalized to all popularized,
I understand.
yes.
I think the better way to answer your POI is that we should take away the source of this crime in the first place, the source of what creates this power imbalance, that is the use of a weapon. Because if you have people on equal footing and without any deadly weapons in the equation, it makes it much more likely that a victim would actually be able to get away from their attacker or overpower their attacker. Guns, because they are automatic, because they are deadly, because one bullet can take a life, that's why we oppose. Going on to the third substantive argument, on-side opposition. That the right to bear arms perpetuates a toxic gun culture. A gun culture is when guns become a celebrated part of a certain society's culture. This looks like gun shows in the United States that are at state fairs where you can literally just buy a gun without any restrictions. We see that these events are celebrated. We see fathers taking their sons to gun shows and gun exhibits, and that when they buy their first gun, it is a monumental step in adulthood. Now, the first layer of analysis under this argument is that this particular gun culture promotes toxic masculinity. In countries like America that have glorified the right to own a gun, masculinity has been tied to owning these weapons. Many men in the southern United States deem owning a gun, quote, manly, posting pictures of their rifles and their pistols on social media and championing their weapons. But we see that the violence that is associated with the result of these guns has become increasingly associated with men themselves. For example, not a single mass shooter in the past 5 years has been a woman. They have been a male. What does this do to the perception of men in society? We see that men are associated unfairly with violence. They're associated unfairly with being mentally insane in some cases, because all you see in the news is these men that are the ones that are doing this school shooting, that they're perpetuating these type of attacks, because they're the ones that own guns disproportionately. We see that when young boys grow up seeing older men champion their weapons as a rite of passage of some sort into manhood, they begin to see guns and violence as the only way to be respected as a man in society. We also see that this is creating a violent national identity as well, because the widespread use of guns has now associated a country's reputation with the effects of these guns. In America, we are known as a very trigger-happy country. We're not very restricted in terms of getting into conflicts. Why? It's because guns on an individual level are so widespread. Why do we have a military budget that is billions of dollars more, than things like education, like healthcare, things that arguably benefit society more? Why do we see these things? It's because we see that guns have become such a part of our culture as a country, that it is now starting to tarnish our reputation of the international community. That's why we're so proud to oppose on-side opposition, because we understand what our country has done, we understand what the reputation is, and we seek to change that. Thank you.
All right, speaking time was 8 minutes and 12 seconds. All right, I would now like to call upon the third speaker from the team proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, before I get down to my speech, first I will give a quick rebuttal to their extension concerning gun culture. Second, I will make a clarification concerning what is the burden of proof for opposition today. Then that our argument is self-contradictory. They say that firstly, we're saying that this is a universal human right. Secondly, we only give it to certain people. My response is simple. First, it's not true, because we believe that being a human being means you can make responsible and rational decisions for yourself. And human rights should be granted to people who have this capability. We already have this exclusion of children and mad people in the case of criminal justice system, in which we recognize, yes, everyone should have the obligation to pay back and to have the retribution if they've done something wrong. However, we also exclude children and mentally ill people because we know they do not have the rational responsibility to make choices. And that is the same case in gun ownership. So they cannot attack us on this point by saying that we're self-contradictory. Second, let's see what they have proved to us. They say this is a privilege and give us two justifications. They say you can own a gun only when, first, this is good for social welfare, second, it can protect citizens more in the whole society. This only when you fulfill those two preconditions, then you enjoy this privilege. Okay, even if we concede to their ambiguous definition of what is privilege and what is right, I'm going to prove to you, under this narrative, still everyone can have this right. First, coming to social welfare. Opposition say that the gun is designed to kill. This is simply an assertion. We believe that a gun is designed to defend yourself. And the opposition also tell us that giving gun rights is the same as recognizing everyone's right to kill. Okay, let's concede to the definition that gun rights is a right to kill. Then so what? We believe that everyone has the right to kill others using any object that is around you. We believe this is exactly why, at the same time, we have the right to kill, and at the same time, we have the right to defend ourselves. However, in Ops world, everyone has the right to kill others, while only a very restrained minority of people have the right to defend themselves. That's the problem with them today. And what are the people that have the right to actually defend themselves and also has the right to kill today? We believe those are the people who can illegally get guns from the black market, are the terrorists and the murderers, which they themselves so fearful of. Now coming to the second criteria they gave. They say that protecting citizens is a government responsibility, and as long as we can fulfill this responsibility, then people can have the right to own guns. Firstly, we believe that the legalization of owning gun, they're basically saying that legalization of owning gun will create public hysteria, will create fear, and that's why this is not fulfilling government responsibility to protect. However, first response, actually, we are the side that is giving more responsibility to protect by the government. Why is that? Because your right to own a gun is a supplement to government responsibility to protect, because you can protect yourself better, as my first speaker already told you. Second, what causes hysteria is not owning gun, the right itself, but the power asymmetry caused by some people has more mechanized guns versus others has non-mechanized guns. That's why we said in our policy, everyone can only get non-mechanized guns, which means that there is no power asymmetry between gun owners. Now, they also said in their third speech, they say that homicide and suicide is bad, and that's why we believe we should not own guns. Firstly, note that all their three speeches has never attacked us on the principle level why this is not an inalienable right. As my first speaker already told you, this is something that is not contingent on the practical level. They have only attacked us on the practical level. Second, concerning their example of every 1,000 of cases that you can defend yourself, there are 52,000 and stuff. We believe that this is actually the same with cars, right? Every 100 of cars driving on the road, you can see thousands of car accidents behind that. But that's not the reason that we deny people the right to drive cars. Now, coming to the second thing about political rights. They're basically saying that government protection is enough, that's why we don't need this right. Now, let's see whether government protection is enough. They're basically saying that there are military force by the government, there are defensive classes, and all those things. Okay, so even if we're talking about, like, we're taking the biggest burden on our side, let's take them at their best. Even if we're talking about the of violence only when they can have guns. And that's why we believe people should always retain the right to get guns, because they can never guarantee that the government can eternally be good for people. And even if we say they're not going to use this right, this does not necessarily legitimize not having this right at all. I should retain this right simply because I am a human being and I am a citizen of a state. Based on these, very proud to propose.
All right, speaking time was 8 minutes and 5 seconds. All right. I would now like to call upon the third speaker from Team Opposition. Sorry.
This week, most Europeans that Team USA talked to were very surprised to find out our beliefs on gun culture and the right to bear arms. However, in our society of the United States, when we see that oftentimes within the media, we are consistently selective of what we choose to report on because there's just so many amounts of shootings that we have to talk about the magnitude and how many people have died to be able to determine whether or not to report on them. We think that that's an exact thing that is tied to the fatal right to hold the right to bear arms. In this speech, I'll be doing a couple of things. The first is highlighting 2 strategic flaws made by side proposition before moving on to discussing 2 key questions to determine why the side opposition has won. The first being on what side does what's best for individuals, the second being which side does what's best for society. The third thing I'll be doing is a comparison of the 2 worlds. But on to the strategic flaws in today's debate. We tell you first off that they give you this laundry list at the top of their one, and they kind of extend this out the debate of these regulations with the underlying assumption that they ultimately will work. We tell you that there's 2 key problems with this, and we don't get very much engagement. The first is the idea that these regulations ultimately will probably be ineffective. For instance, let's look to the Texas church that has experienced a shooting this past week. We saw that this person had multiple instances of background checks and mental checks to be able to determine that he was unsuited to obtain certain weapons. However, the regulations failed to tell the government to not have this. Therefore, he was able to obtain these weapons, go in and massacre a group of people who were just trying to enjoy daily life. We think that what this looks like here is the fact that these regulations don't actually come to fruition. They ultimately become very problematic in the long term. But we tell you secondly, that there's so many regulations that they tell you within the first prop that it ultimately limits this idea of a right. We think that rights can be contested to the government. You can use your rights to be able to determine what you're given to from the minute you enter this world. However, there's a difference between that and privilege. Privileges have limits. The privileges are only obtainable by certain individuals, like people who pass mental background checks, people who are able to be able to go into these certain instances where they are allowed to have certain weapons. That's where we think the difference stands. The second strategic flaw made by side proposition is another underlying assumption. They tell you that once you get rid of this one form of defense with guns, right? They tell you that it's ultimately getting rid of all. We tell you insofar that the idea that guns ultimately end up causing more harms with intentional deaths over actual defensive deaths, we think that in the long term, the benefits don't outweigh, they're ultimately more harmful. Secondly, we tell you that there's plenty of alternative forms to self-defense, as we do in our second speech. We tell you that there's things like self-defense classes. Why is this distinctly different? We tell you that this is given to you by a professional who tells you how to handle the situation calmly. When you're given a fatal weapon and you're not told how to use it calmly, that's where you see ultimately things becoming much, much worse. So let's move on to the first question in today's debate, which is which side does what's best for an individual? We have to examine what the difference is between rights and versus privileges given to individuals within society. So let's examine this on 2 layers, right? What do rights ultimately look like? We think that what it looks like is ultimately something that's properly due to a citizen, something that they have a claim to in society. To the point at which we have to be a little bit intuitive here. We think that people who have a right over certain things, do they have the right to be able to claim the lives of others? Do people have the right to kill another individual? I think, morally, no. So ultimately there, we think that why should we give them the right then to obtain an object that is designed specifically to take away life? We think that that's the intuitive analysis here that consistently gets unengaged with by side proposition. But then let's examine what do privileges look like. We tell you that it's extreme measures, the restrictions that the government offers to you, to be able to tell you whether or not you're allowed to obtain a certain thing. We think that that's why proposition crosses over the House when they give you these intense regulations in their first prop. But then, we tell you that because there is a right, there is also room to contest and fight this. We think that in the long term, if you have your rights invaded, you can contest the government for that. When you have a privilege and you disobey the regulations placed for that privilege, you can stop that. But I'll take your point.
I have already told you that right is based on the ability to make rational and responsible decisions. And that's why we have all those regulations before you can obtain a gun. Please respond to that.
We already have. We've told you that there's a difference between privileges and rights. I just gave you that analysis right there. We told you that when you have a right, it's something that you can contest the government for. However, when you have a privilege, it's something that the government can contest you for. We think ultimately, in our world, we're making more restrictions and more regulations. In your world, you should be giving the unevitable right that people should be able to obtain these guns without any regulations. But then, let's talk about the topic of self-defense, right? We tell you that they give you this assumption that guns are the best way to be able to prevent this. But ultimately, we gave you a very, very powerful statistic here. They tell you that with 1,000 successful instances of defense, there's 52,000 instances of intentional deaths that come with guns. We think that if you're given this scenario, we think it's pretty clear what outweighs, right? But then they tell you, well, there's other things that we don't limit, like knives, like, certain things such as cars, but we have to look to what the purpose of these things are. Cars are destined for transportation. Guns are destined to kill. Knives are destined to spread butter on the bread that is given to us from the hostel, right? We think that there's a vast difference between a couple of things that I just told you there. One is destined for something that's simply civil, and the other is destined for something that's fatal. But then, we think that sure, everything can be dangerous, but if the purpose of it entails to ultimately harm someone, that's problematic. And then they give you this small argument about, well, people can go to the black market and find it. We think ultimately in our world, it's going to be much more hard to find it. And I would assume that everyone in this room has no relation to the black market. We don't know where to start to find the black market. That's why you see things that make it ultimately much more difficult. But the second question is, which side does what's best for society? We think today's debate is centered around the idea of individuals' autonomy over the aspect of societal welfare. Here's why, if everything I just told you about the individual didn't cut it for you, why you're going to look to the societal welfare to outweigh it. We tell you that what is the effect that gun culture has on society. We give you great analysis with this in our tube. We tell you that toxic masculinity is something that plagues our society, especially in countries where gun and trigger-happy emotions seem to continue to be a part of it. We tell you that let's look to the United States. It's manly to own a gun. It's manly to obtain certain things as violence because it's unmanly to be able to express things like emotions, to cry, to see those things. Why? Because it's been ingrained in society for so long. Men fight in wars. Men lead countries. Why? Because they perpetuate aspects of violence. We think that this ultimately creates this national identity here, right? That promotes violence over the promotion of cooperation. That's very problematic. But then, they tell you that really toxic masculinity is not that big of a deal because we don't give you enough impacts. Well, okay, let's think to the myriad of harms that come from toxic masculinity. We see things like rape, domestic violence against women. We see things like aggressive natures and a competitive aura that they consistently bring to a workforce. We think that those are a myriad of things that impact the daily lives of individuals, that stamper upon women's lives. We think that it's things that consistently bring us down in the long term. What we think is, if that's not enough for opposition to believe, as an impact, then I'm truly sorry. But we tell you that the government should give you this right to obtain this. We think that the government is the best one to enforce these in the long term because they're the ones with the most resources. They're the ones that best acclimate us. Their duty in life is to protect the citizens. Insofar that I can offer you two worlds, one where you can save 1,000 lives, and one where you can save 52,000 lives. I think the option is pretty clear in today's debate. You're going to be favoring the one which can save more, right? And so far that we think in today's debate that it's very clear who provides the right of life. It's truly the side of opposition. Thank you.
time was 8 minutes and 8 seconds. Okay, reply speeches will be 6 minutes long. 4 minutes, all right. Reply speeches will be 4 minutes long. There will be no points of information, and a knock will be sounded 1 minute before the end of the speaking time. And I now call upon team opposition to give their reply speech.
In this debate, we were supposed to analyze the question about whether an individual's right to own a gun outweighs the societal benefits that side opposition gives you. We hear little to no engagement on this point from side opposition. So in this debate, I'm going to be analyzing the issue through that lens, on both the principle level of the debate and then the practical level of the debate. So first on principle, we have 2 key clash points. First, about the extent of what a right is, and then second, about gun culture. So first, on this extent of a right, side proposition says that the right to a gun can be limited and still be considered a right. We say quite the opposite. We say they restrict it to the point where it becomes a privilege instead. We contend that side proposition is crossing the house because a right should be available to everybody mentally capable of exercising that right, which is an analysis side proposition themselves give. But in their model, they not only add these mental restrictions, but also skill-based tests on guns about training. That is something that goes beyond the scope of limiting rights based on mental capability and then transfers it to skill capability. That's why we think they have restricted it to the point where it becomes a privilege and not a right. That's why we think they're crossing the house there. But even if you could restrict rights in this way, we say that the damage the guns cause and the massive amount of loss of life we have seen from every week of school shootings that we have seen in the United States and the terrorist attacks we've seen throughout Europe, that we are willing to sacrifice the right to bear arms to promote societal welfare, to protect millions of lives that might otherwise be lost if guns continue to be as widespread as they are. We are willing to sacrifice the rights of an individual to protect the lives of millions of individuals throughout society. Now going on to the second clash point about gun culture. First, we have 2 points here about toxic masculinity and about the violent national identity that's created as a result. Layla gives you very nice analysis about why toxic masculinity itself is bad. It hurts women through domestic violence. It hurts men through an increase in suicide rates of men when they can't actually deal with this toxic masculinity. We see that these guns themselves associate unfairly men with violence. We think this is an unfair stereotype. Side proposition tries to say it's good, but gives no analysis as to why it would be good, and we think that it's not good because we don't think that men are inherently violent, and perpetuating this notion only increases the likelihood of violent crime committed by men in the first place. So what we see is that society is harmed both externally through this violent national identity that causes countries like the U.S. to start nosing around in other people's business and starting wars, and we see internally this is harmful because it harms society's perceptions of gender roles that is ultimately going to be destabilizing society as a whole. In the practical level of debate, we had a huge clash point about crime, whether crime is increased or decreased in our world. We say on side opposition, crime decreases, because we see that guns' purpose is to kill individuals. Side proposition gives you the example of, oh, if you're faced with a murderer with a gun, you need to defend yourself. But in the world of side opposition, the murderer wouldn't have a gun in the first place. You don't need the right to self-defense as often at the point at which guns don't become as common and aren't as dangerous when violent crime goes down. And so, when we see that the right to self-defense doesn't have to be exercised as frequently, you can use other less deadly weapons, and you can use things like self-defense classes to protect yourself on an individual level. But refer to the analysis we also give you about why governmental protection is much better, because it is standardized, because governments have more resources to ensure accountability for law enforcement officers and things of that nature that allow for crime to be stopped at the source. So when this round breaks down, let's compare the two worlds. On side proposition, you have a world in which people live in fear, because anybody they pass on the street can have a gun, where they feel pressured to own a gun, to defend themselves, in case some lunatic starts shooting people. We see inside opposition's world that guns don't become as widespread. You see this crime decrease because people don't feel pressure to do this. We see that men don't feel the need to associate themselves with violence. We see that governments have the ability to regulate these programs. We see that the right to owning a gun can be limited and should be limited to the point where it is not a right, it is a privilege, and that we value the lives of the millions who have been killed in school shootings more than the rights of an individual to have a possibility of defending themselves. That's why we're so proud to oppose.
Speaking time was 4 minutes and 20 seconds. All right, I now call upon the reply speaker to keep proposition.
The right to bear arms is fundamental for me as a human being, also crucial for me as a citizen in face of the state. 3 questions in today's debate: whether bearing arms is a right or privilege. Secondly, whether government protection or any other alternative, such as self-defense courses, can work as effective as bearing arms. And thirdly, on the comparison of harms and benefits brought by both sides. So firstly, today the opposition simply accused us because we put 3 single regulations to individuals to have access to a gun. So that is a privilege. However, as our second speaker have already proven to you, in the cases of minors and mentally disabled people who cannot make rational decisions for themselves, and they cannot bear the consequences caused by themselves, we say that it's not legitimate for them to exercise their rights. This does not deny the legitimacy for every other individual to have access to a right. And moreover, as proposition side, we give you why the right to bear arms is fundamental. Two layers. Firstly, it's fundamental human rights for self-defense. It's first fundamental human rights for me to preserving my bodily well-being. And secondly, it's crucial political rights for citizens who are in face of to act as a deterrence power to the state. Because we see that these citizens in a dictatorship regime can never have the power to overthrow a regime, simply because the state holds much more power, much more access to violence than a single citizen. And moving on to the second question, whether government protection and other alternatives can work. The opposition side simply argued that the government is principally justifiable to protect the citizens, but they never responded to my point, whether states can be really with every single citizen 24/7. We see that as long as this instance exists, the government can never protect every citizen every minute you need. So we see that this creates a need for every individual to bear arm when it's needed. And we see that when they say that, and they argue that government can better protect as they have stronger military power or something. We see that it's not mutually exclusive because in our side we still have policemen to protect these citizens, but as a common safety. As building up the common safety net. Moreover, in our side, which is exclusive achieved, we can have individuals to defend themselves when the police cannot come on time. And so moving on to the third layer of harms and benefits. Firstly, the opposition side are so scared of the assumption made by themselves that giving the right to bear arms is equals to the right to kill. Firstly, we say that this is not the original idea of guaranteeing the people the rights, because we have already proven to you the original idea is for self-defense. And secondly, even if it is guaranteed the right to kill, we do not see it as necessarily evil in every case, because we see that in the status quo, we guarantee the right to kill a person when he is possessing significant threat to you. So Secondly, the second harm the opposition mentioned is about this overall societal harm. However, we say that their assumption is that by guaranteeing the people rights, there will be more gunshots. However, we say that this is because. However, in both sides, these people who intend to hurt people still exist. However, in our side, our citizens can actually have the power to defend themselves. We agree that gun actually can act as two functions, such as to kill and to defend. In our side, our citizens have more access to defend themselves. And thirdly, third harm on the idea of gun culture, we say that it is because of the patriarchal narrative that only allows holding on guns to be a privilege to men. That causes a problem. It's not necessarily so that's why we're going to make gun access to everyone as a right. And on the proposition side, we have told you the benefits of less crime because through analyzing the criminal's mentality, we have proven to you the benefits of the deterrence for the state, especially when the state is acting as dictators and suppressing the individual's needs. It is the only way for the individual to act against the state and to fight for their own benefits. Based on all that, very proud to propose.
Right. Speaking time was 4 minutes and 32 seconds.
Okay, we will ask debaters and audience to leave the room. The results will be announced by the judges downstairs in the center.